Eric is a career therapist and educator with a passion for building community and discovering wisdom through the overlaps of various knowledge traditions. Eric began his manual therapy career in New Mexico in '96 and studied various manual therapy approaches. His greatest amount of training was in craniosacral therapy. Eric became the youngest CST instructor at the age of just 28 in 2001 and began teaching CST internationally for the Upledger Institute. Loving the intersection of body, mind, and spirit, Eric completed a master's in marriage, family, and child therapy in 2007. In 2008, Eric moved to California, where he acted as the director of education at the Esalen Institute until 2013. Those experiences at Esalen provided many valuable experiences and connections in the world of humanistic study and education. Currently, Eric remains in California with a busy private practice in Carmel and San Francisco. He continues to teach multiple levels of CST for the Upledger Institute, including cadaveric dissection. In addition to his CST work, Eric has developed the systems-informed body-mind work that takes a complex systems view of integrating the mind and body. He also founded and published an online periodical called The Idea Crucible, focused on body, mind, spirit, integration, and practice. In his spare time, I don't know how he comes up with any of that. Eric is doing it. This is Eric's spare time as a doctoral level coursework in clinical psychology, and is completing a several-year meditation teacher training program with Jack Cornfield and Tara Brock. You may correct me on that, Eric, if I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
That sounds perfect. Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate it. All right.
Thank you.
Well, let's see. Welcome, everybody. Oh, and Justin, I'm going to let you handle letting new people into the call now, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, and do you have me pinned? Yeah, you have me spotlighted. Great, I appreciate it. All right, well, welcome everybody. I would say I'm glad to see you here. I can't actually see you with all the cameras turned off. I know that's just the format right here, but I'm very happy to be here. So I'll just begin by giving some acknowledgments. Really want to thank the Upledger Institute for hosting these and kind of empowering Justin to kind of run the show with these. Thankful for the In Touch series that are every month bringing new discussions like this. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to give one of these. So hopefully you'll find what we talk about interesting, and we'll have a chance for some chat dialogue. And at the end, if time permits, we may even ask you to unmute yourself and hear a couple of questions live. All right. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to bring up my presentation. All right. Well, as you heard in the bio, I actually have been teaching for the Institute for a while, and I've taught a number of things around the world related to body, mind, spirit. One of the classes that I find most impactful to practitioners is the cadaver dissection class that we teach. And I've attended the class many times as a student, and eventually became an instructor for the class. And it is by far one of the most satisfying courses I get to teach, and I feel deeply privileged to be able to do so. And so I think kind of the goal for today is to just talk a little bit about dissection. Now, I'll be honest with you, since this is a public event, I'm not going to be showing any gory dissection pictures. You know, we're just going to be talking a little bit about the class and a little bit about some of the lessons that can come out of human cadaver dissection. And I imagine that by the end of my presentation, you might get a little bit of an idea of why I wouldn't want to share gory pictures in a presentation like this as well. All right, so the title, as you can see right there, is Lessons from Dissection, Body, Mind, Spirit Gifts for the Manual Therapist. So, I mean, honestly, it's body, mind, spirit gifts for anyone, but since the course I teach is for therapists who put their hands on people as part of the work that they do, wanted to approach it from that point of view. All right, so let's get there. And by the way, just as a little bit of a roadmap, we are going to do a little bit of chat participation to get started. And then I'm going to go into just a brief history of cadaver dissection, and hopefully it will be an interesting history for you. And then at the end of it, I want to talk a little bit about the scientific aspects of the course, as well as the humanistic aspects of the course. And then we'll just take some questions and see what comes up from there. All right, so that's the roadmap for the next little chunk of time that we have. Let's keep on going. So first off, just a big welcome to all of you. And yeah, welcome, and the subtitle that I have there is Exploring Our Humanity. I think as you listen to this presentation, listen to me, one of the main reasons for doing dissection is in the gifts that it gives us and exploring our humanness and our mortality, in addition to the education, the anatomical education that we receive. All right, so here's where we're going to be jumping into the chat box. And, we got a lot of us here, so not as much as I would personally love to hear from everybody that's, in person and get to know you. That's not actually possible in this type of format. And so thank you in advance for just being willing to type in the chat box. And so get ready to type in the chat box, whether you're on your phone or whether you're on your computer. And let's just do a couple of chat prompts and we'll get to know each other a little bit that way. So the first chat prompt for us is, the first chat prompt for you is, what is your dissection experience? I imagine some of you don't have any at all. Some of you have quite a bit, and some of you maybe have a little bit, or maybe some of you did some dissection in high school, or some animals, or there are probably some hunters in the group. So please, let's just chat in there. I would love to hear, what is your dissection experience? And I'm going to read a few of these out loud as we go. So 0, none. Oh, we actually have somebody, hi Melinda, who did the class with me in 2018. Wonderful. Bunch of people with no experience. Oh, somebody always wanted to take the class. Okay, and then here we have somebody who did it in their physical therapy training. That's common. I imagine a number of you in here have done gross anatomy as part of your licensure. Awesome. And with gross anatomy, oftentimes you're dissecting preserved cadavers. In the class we run, we're actually working with unpreserved cadavers, which has very different aspects to it. All right, let's see. Oh, Vicky, all right, done some cadaver. Took a class and before. Nice. Yeah, so different amounts of experience that people have had. Oh, has somebody here has done a fresh visceral dissection? Yeah, ones where they're already dissected. Oh, animal work. A lot of you have done it in classes. Oh, we see watched virtual dissection class online. Yeah, nice. Okay. Bunch of it. Oh, animal dissection in high school and cadaver dissection in PT school. Processing pigs, chicken, and deer. All I would imagine. Oh, it's so wonderful to see all of these. Okay. Oh, here's a good one. Butcher as a young man, 2 embalmed cadavers. Looking forward to doing one with you. And oh, Jim, I recognize that name as well. Sweet. All right. Well, thank you for that one. All right. So as you can see, there's a great variety of dissection experience in the room with us here for however many of us are. Well, it looks like we have 112 on here right now. Next prompt that I'd like to have you keep typing in the chat box. And these are maybe a tiny bit provocative for some people. Just, would you consider donating your body to science? Yes, of course, already have. Okay, so some of you have, maybe. Oh, there's always a lot contained in the maybes for people who are thinking about it. Not sure, yes, I would. Yep, not sure. Already set it up. Wow, some of you have already gone through that process. Okay. And then the no, not everybody wants to do it. Not that there's no correct answer here. Personal choice is important. Oh, organs. Yeah, working on the process of donation. Okay. And a big capital no in there as well. Somebody who definitely does not want that to happen to them. The good one, can't imagine that they would want to see it, of course. All right. And I would imagine that for a lot of you, even just being asked a question, there's already an emotional reaction to that, whether it's a robust yes or a robust no, or even kind of an ambivalent maybe somewhere in the middle. It's one of those questions that does, in fact, tend to elicit a bit of an emotional reaction or response. And it might just take a moment to think about that. It's like, well, what is it about this possibility of donating your body to science that would bring up that kind of a reaction? You probably have an answer already. Now, here's a similar question, and I'm curious if it changes the answer for any of you all. What reaction might you have if a cherished relative, your mother or your child or your grandmother or your significant other, What reaction might you have if a cherished reaction informs you they're donating their body to science? Okay, so a lot of you are saying respect and good for them. Oh, there's none. It's against my church upbringing. Yeah, absolutely. There are different cultural aspects to the idea of dissection and different religious aspects. We're going to see that in the history of dissection a little bit as well. All right, got a bunch of those. Okay with it, cool. Their body, their choice. Yeah. My parents already did, and so I think they would be happy. Yeah. Great for them. People ask why they want to. Yeah, and that's another one of those questions. It tends to be a question that elicits a strong reaction from people. Just try, in a conversation with some strangers, mention that you're going to donate your body to science. You're going to get some questions that come out of that. Yeah. All right. So you're already starting to get an idea there, that not everybody's the same. We know that, of course. Oh yeah, not sure. Great reaction. So what are some common reactions that people have to the cadaver dissection? One of the privileges of teaching the course is, I basically get to hang out with 14 students over 3 days where we take a full donor and 2 heads and we kind of deconstruct them and learn as much as we can in a few days. And so really get to see people's reactions firsthand to encountering a cadaver for the first time in many situations, or even the idea of it. It's not a neutral question. It's not a neutral topic for anybody. So some common themes when people come to a dissection class, I would say probably the number one theme is that there's a great deal of curiosity. Oh my goodness, what's it going to be like? What am I going to see? What's the smell going to be like? Am I going to get messy? All those other questions, or what am I going to learn? Another common theme that almost everybody has is some element of nervousness. Even people who have a lot of dissection experience, sometimes walking into a lab can bring up that nervousness all over again. And then even for our case, we have an awful lot of students who did dissection as part of their gross anatomy training, as part of their original licensure, but they know that we're about to do unpreserved dissection. And the difference between preserved and unpreserved dissection is huge, because with a preserved body, the tissues are kind of waxy and plastic, and they don't feel like us. They feel kind of like extremely overcooked turkey. And the color is not there either. Whereas with unpreserved, you get to see us inside in all of our colorful, vibrant, juicy glory. And all the tissues feel the same. The material, the tissues feel exactly the same as it feels like when you're touching anybody else. Just cold. Okay. Another common reaction for people is discomfort. I would say that's pretty universal for people as well, even if they're not necessarily aware of it or necessarily admitting it. It's possible to see when somebody walks into the lab for the first time. For some people, there's a strong element of revulsion. The idea of taking who we are can really bring up strong feelings. The people who really have that feeling probably would never self-select into taking the class in the first place, but it's still there a lot of the times. For most people, there's a huge level of excitement. And in fact, the excitement is what often overrides the nervousness and overrides the discomfort. So that turns into a wonderful experience for people. Inevitably, everybody has questions. What's it going to smell like? What's it going to look like? What's everything else going to be? And then something that will come up occasionally, which is a vague sense of violation. Now, that can be a little bit of a challenging one. But knowing, when we walk around the world and we see people around us, they're intact. And so knowing that we're about to actually see inside of someone, if you don't have a lot of that experience already, can be a bit confronting for some people. And then, of course, a common theme is whatever made you sign up for this presentation. You have a reason why you decided to sign up for this and why you're sitting there across from your phone or your computer right this moment. And that's got to be unique to you, even if it shares commonalities with other people. So that's a common thing too, whatever made you want to come to this presentation. And then, as you'll see, one of my main reasons why I love teaching this is not just for the anatomical discovery, but also for the existential discovery of being human. So some other common themes as people go through the class and have their experiences working with dissection, I'm sure we could use different words for this. How I wrote it was just an unnameable feeling created by a non-ordinary and urgent experience. it is, for most of us, it is not a common thing to cut someone open. And that's what I mean by a non-ordinary experience. And so there's that sort of anticipation that can have a little mixture of dread for some people, a mixture of excitement for some people, and the sense of urgency, because you're going to know that in a short period of time it's about to happen, even if you're just watching. And so those are the moments that I find most sacred in this kind of work in particular. And so I generally think of the whole process of doing cadaver dissection as being an experience which, for everybody, every last person, kind of thins the boundary between our lives and our deaths, thins the boundary between our lives and our mortality. Okay. So to deepen into this a little bit for why I think this is such an emotional and fraught topic for a lot of people, even when they're super excited about it, I do want to do a brief history of dissection. I find this interesting. Hopefully you will a little bit as well. And as we start talking about the history of dissection, I think what I find interesting is that not when you look at the details, I'm not going to do a history lecture with a bunch of details like you might have done in high school, but more that there are tremendous movements and energies and tensions that are very, very human that kind of underlie the history of dissection. And so as you pay attention to the history of dissection, you see people behaving just the same way people are behaving now. And the same tensions are in the world right now, just in slightly different ways. And so the history of dissection reflects all the same feelings and tensions that we saw just now in the microcosm of the chat responses that you all gave. And the same feelings and tensions that I get to see whenever I have a bunch of participants in the class for the first time. Those feelings of maybe a tiny bit of revulsion, excitement, the knowledge and the learning, the tipping scale between the sacred and the profane, sometimes hanging around, being in the lab can have this tremendous kind of luminosity to it, the sacred feel to it. And other times it's just like, no, this is messy with things that don't feel right. And as we also talk about the history, it's people did a lot of horrible things in the history of dissection. And so it's yet another example of the marvelous ingenuity that human beings have and their moral flexibility as well. All right, so let's do a couple of details on the history. I'm going to go through this quickly. I know not everybody gets excited about history. So first off, dissection begins, as far as we know, in ancient Greece and Alexandria in particular. And there was a very short period, just the lives, only the length of the lives of two men in 3rd century BC, where dissection was done for the sake of human knowledge and human medicine. And those two individuals were Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios. And they were trying to learn about human anatomy and teach it to their physicians and to their doctors. And the people that they worked with, I probably shouldn't use the word donor. You'll notice that when I talk about cadaver dissection, I'll use the word donor because I think it's a respectful term and it's accurate for people in today's world. Back then, though, they weren't donors. No, they were executed criminals that were given by the royalty to those two guys in order to run their dissection. And even then, there was a large sense that dissection was kind of morally not okay. But it worked out in Alexandria because at that time, Alexandria wanted to view itself as a beacon of knowledge and learning and kind of like high society and high intellectuality. And so those two individuals were able to do that. But when they both died, human dissection completely stopped, as far as we know, and it essentially disappeared for 1400 years. That would be the next time that we start seeing dissection happen again. So let's fast forward 1400 years, and now we're talking about 14th century Italy. And basically, dissection died in large part because of the spread of Christianity in Europe in the Middle Ages. Now, that is not a diss on religion at all. It's just more of an acknowledgement that moral frames can change to go from a value of science and knowledge to a value of we don't want to violate the human body. We don't want to violate the sacredness of this vessel and other kind of aspects to that. A scholar who is a really marvelous individual that I've happened to meet a few times, and he's a heck of a nice guy, A guy by the name of Jeff Kripal, he's a scholar of comparative religions at Rice University. And he's written some amazing books. I would encourage you to check him out. Anyway, as a scholar of comparative religions who professionally has studied world religions, he'll kind of characterizes it that a lot of what religion concerns itself with, all human religions, is with what he calls the porousness of humanity. And just sort of acknowledging that as human beings, we have things that come into us and things that come out of us. And it can be food and it can be other activities that you can imagine. And that most human religions in some capacity concern themselves with trying to control and regulate that porousness of humanity, whether it be through diet and what we eat, or through sexuality, or in this case, the house of the soul, which would have been how it would have been looked at that time. And so dissection would have been profane. It would have been something that would have violated a certain amount of sacredness. So what inevitably made dissection reappear in the 14th century was actually the creation of universities. It was a movement out of those dark ages and the movement into the science once again. And so with the appearance of universities in Paris and Bologna and Oxford and Montpellier and Padua, we started seeing human dissection again. But even at that time, religious leaders were forbidden to participate in human dissection. It was just something that the doctors were doing. So you continue to see that sort of tension between what's considered sacred and what's not considered sacred. Now, once dissection started happening again, now 13th through 18th centuries, dissection started becoming more and more popular. And here's where we get those tensions and those forces that kind of move human behavior again. And in this one, basically, as dissection became more popular, there was you can think of it as supply and demand. There was a greater demand for bodies than there was a supply, which made people start doing really crummy things to each other. So as dissection became more acceptable, the demand for bodies exceeded the availability of bodies. And so what ended up happening, without going into the gory details, it led to really unsavory and close ties between criminality, punishment, and dissection, particularly in public opinion and government policy. And so you can essentially imagine if there's a need for bodies, and the only way to get a body is within those days is if the person was an executed criminal. It's not like there's going to be a major increase in crime. So things, for example, where the government would start finding more things to call an executable offense. So that way the universities have more bodies. So, maybe at one point it was just something really heinous ended up in you getting killed. And that just kind of magnified all over the place because of the supply and demand issue. Crazy. So the number of crimes considered punishable by execution rose to meet the demands, which of course further made dissection be something intimately linked with criminality. It's like nobody would want to be dissected if the only people dissected are executed criminals who did the worst things possible. And also as part of it, because these are the days before things like refrigeration and before preservation and all of that. And so you can imagine in a hot summer, bodies are going to rot, are a lot quicker. And so it meant that there became unsavory links between anatomists and the executors, where they would like bribe the executors to kill somebody at a certain time or try to have things happen more in the colder hours or in the colder months rather than in the really hot ones. So horrible, horrible things. And other things that started to happen in these time periods, you've probably heard the term grave robbing, where somebody be freshly buried and then a group of people would go out and basically dig up the body and then go take it for the sake of dissection. And then even body snatching. Sometimes the demand was so great that people just outright like raid a funeral and run off with the body in order to try to find something for dissection. And some horrible stories come out of that as well. And in some situations, there's just flat out murder. People are killing each other in order to try to meet those demands. So not a real pretty time for dissection. And I think without going any further, you can see how shameful and undesirable it would be in those centuries to be somebody dissected. And so that's the tension that creates a problem for us as we move into the modern day. And plus, even dissection back then looked very different than it does now. Whereas dissection now might be about, working with the donor and learning something about anatomy. And back then, it was more like the bodies were seen more as like illustrations to the textbook, if you will. And there was still that belief that the actual dissection itself was a shameful and not a desirable thing to do. So for the longest time, the way dissections were done is you had a lector. That was the person who was actually reading from the anatomy book and not even paying any attention to the dissection that was going along. Then there was an individual called the stensor who would point at the part of the body that needed to be cut. And then the sector, who was often, we've probably heard the term barber surgeons, because those were the individuals who were skilled in working with sharp objects in those days. So the sector or the barber surgeon was the one who actually did the dissection. So you can even see in that setup, there's a big separation between the person who has a respectable profession and the one who's actually doing the cutting. And as I mentioned, even back then, dissection wasn't to be learned from, but more as an illustration of the text. And a lot of these were done publicly. So that further highlighting that it was a punishment, that you do something bad, you're going to be dissected publicly, and that's the worst thing that you want to have happen. And all the gawkers would come out and look, and just not a good time for this process. Now, it became, as we moved on into like the 19th century, they started to realize that the connection to criminality was not helping acquire necessary bodies in order to learn from a dissection. And so there was a shift in about the mid-19th century, the shift from criminality to poverty. And because the demand for body was so high, the Anatomy Act in England in 1832, they started to allow unclaimed bodies of the poor to be used. So you didn't have to be a criminal, you're just poor and without a family. And because this was Britain was an imperial society and had colonies all around the world, there was actually a pretty big global impact with this change, including the countries they had colonized. So lots of cultural violations are going to move out of that one as well. And so what ended up happening, it's a desirable shift to move dissection away from criminality, not particularly helpful to have it be connected with poverty and the undesirable aspects of society, though. And so the poor, the undesirable, the mentally ill, the ethnically different were largely viewed as a burden to society. And so it kind of highlighted the gap between the wealthy and the poor and the underprivileged in that one, because the poor were largely considered as being drains on society at that point. And so the dissection was almost viewed as, well, at least this person's giving something back with their useless life. That would have been kind of the thought process back then, not a particularly good feeling at all. And you can imagine that would really deeply divide and deepen the divide between the wealthy and the poor during those time periods. We're not talking that long ago. We're talking mid-19th century here. So now, and we're getting a little bit closer towards the end of the history portion, just to let you know, as we move into the 19th and the 20th centuries, people really started doing crummy things to each other. That drive of it being something shameful and something exploitable was not good. So with the low status of the body actually being used for dissection, the human atrocities grew significantly. And so there are direct connections between the world of slavery and human dissection, where, slaves were considered were considered property of the slave owners that they could do anything with. And so selling them off to dissection was part of the medical movement in the 19th century, unfortunately. It also goes for the homeless, the mentally ill, the poor, the immigrant communities. And then probably some of the worst, of course, happened in World War II in Nazi Germany, whereas the Nazis were using an awful lot of their war crimes as basically cadaver dissection at that time. So what turned that around? Because we don't have that exact same feeling now, thankfully. And so in the 20th century, we finally started having some changing attitudes around dissection. Notice how recent this is. We're just talking 1968. This is well within a lot of our lifetimes now. So the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act of 1968 was a major decision, legal decision, that basically said that the person donating their body, that their wishes to donate the body could override the wishes of their family. It wasn't like that before. Somebody could donate their body to science and the family could be like, no, I don't want that. That's not okay, and override it. So just that law by itself went a long way towards enhancing the respectability and empowering the person who's actually choosing to donate their body to science. Now, as part of it, there in the 20th century, an awful lot of doctors found tremendous value in going through gross anatomy in medical school. And so it started to be more common for doctors to donate to their body to science in order to support the profession and future doctors. And as doctors started doing it, it started changing and challenging the attitude of dissection as being something that's undesirable and challenging the attitude that was connected to poverty. And additionally, doctors began talking to patients as an option that families might have as they contemplate end-of-life needs. And so just that 1968 right there, that's a critical step towards creating autonomy, value, and respect for human donation. And then laws have continued to be passed regarding informed consent of the person choosing to donate, even within the past 40 years. So that's one thing I really want you to walk away from, is that we have a positive view of will body donation now. It's within all of our lifetimes that transformation has happened. And because it's so recent, given the immense history of dissection, it's one of the reasons why it's a particularly hard-fought and precarious attitude towards human dissection. So the shift into will body donation is a recent cultural shift and a precarious one. So in modern day will body programs, they work really hard to maintain privacy and confidentiality and autonomy and respect for the person. So that way the feelings towards will body donation aren't harmed anymore. So now there's a high level of respect for donors. There are lots of options for donation. There are best practices in how to communicate with family and communicate with donors. Privacy and confidentiality is maintained. And in a lot of cases, particularly with gross anatomy labs, they'll even have services at the conclusion of it and invite the students to come participate. Just respecting the life of the person who donated their body. All right, so that's kind of our little brief history. I hope you found that interesting. And again, the idea is just the very human supply and demand and people being willing to do horrible things to try to meet that demand. And how the vast majority of history there has been really negative, that we're now have shifted a little bit. So what does this mean when I actually teach a class? If you're a manual therapist and you're contemplating doing a dissection class, well, I'm going to divide this portion up, and maybe we have another 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so. I'm going to run this portion. I'm going to talk about the scientific, and I'm going to talk about the human aspects of running a class. Let's begin with the scientific. So the scientific aspects of running a dissection class, I actually really think that modern day manual therapists rely very much on dissection skills, and it enhances the skills and the capacity of a modern day manual therapist to do work with their clients. Because if you're a manual therapist, you need to have the ability to visualize the structure that you're working with. You need to be able to have the skill to palpate the structure that you're working with, assess it, and treat it as well. And so learning from a textbook is one thing, but getting to see these structures and feel their texture in situ is amazing. And it brings a three-dimensionality into a palpation and touch that just isn't possible with watching videos or looking at a textbook or even hearing somebody describe it. So it kind of brings a three or even fourth dimensionality into the palpation and touch through being able to visualize the structure, being able to palpate the structure, being able to locate the structure from different parts and different entrees in the body, as well as knowing what the contraindications are. What are the important structures that you can't push in order to find a structure underneath it, for example? And then also human variation, because even though we tend to have the same structures, they're not all located in the same area. And so as you see more and more donors, you start to realize, oh, there's a big variety in us on the inside as well as on the outside. And then I also believe that if we're manual therapists, doing cadaver dissection actually elevates the profession by making us more respectful of the work that we're doing, as well as more knowledgeable about the work that we're doing and better able to communicate with other healthcare professionals. So those are all the scientific aspects of running a course like this and why it's necessary. And if you've been listening to me so far, you know that it's the human ones that I also really value as well. And so I'm just going to tell a couple of dissection stories here. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class in Baltimore, Maryland, and one of our participants there, on the last day, after we've basically done all the major dissections, we do end up opening the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, and we do end up removing as many of the organs as we can. And so what it means is that participants will have a chance to actually feel a human heart outside of the body, as well as a human lung and the liver and a few other organs, and that have not been preserved. And so I remember it was roughly around the middle of the third day. Our donor was fairly fully deconstructed at that point, and we had removed a number of the organs. And I remember seeing one student over in the corner of the room, standing in front of a tray, and her back was to me. And part of my job as a teacher is to make sure that everybody's safe and everybody's doing okay. And so the rest of the room was doing well. And so I just walked up and checked in on that student. And as I walked up and stepped beside her, she was holding the human heart in her hands with tears streaming down her face and crying. And part of what she was experiencing was just a deep, deep sacred appreciation of what it's like to hold this structure in her hands that beat continuously for like 83 years and some change without ever stopping. Just the sheer amazingness of that. And then being able to open it and see all those little fine structures within it, those chordae tendineae and the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve and the major blood vessels that come out of the heart and the different cavities and that septum in the middle. Amazing stuff. Another story is, on the second day, we turn our donor over, we do a full laminectomy, open up the entire spine, get to actually see all the structures of the spinal cord and the membranous layers around it and the fluid that pack it and how the nerves kind of move through the foramina and exit outward into the body. And so it's not an easy dissection to do it, but we do end up doing a full laminectomy, get to see all the structures of the spine and those nerve rootlets coming out. And then after we've all had a chance to palpate and look at it, then what we'll do is I'll very carefully just take a scalpel or scissors, cut through all the peripheral nerves, which by itself is a big deal if you figure how much nerve pain can bother us. And so one lucky participant will then have a chance to pick up a human spine, and then we usually have a tray of water ready in which to place it so that way that spine can just sort of float and move around within the water. And there is something really special about being able to hold a human spine in your hands, particularly if you know all that it does for a person. Other lessons that can sometimes happen is, an awful lot of our donors are old or elderly at their time of death and may have been wheelchair bound or may have been, less mobile, working with a walker. And so it's interesting to see because you start to see muscular changes and joint changes. And that's possible as maybe dissecting a shoulder girdle, for example, to see how the joint has actually changed due to chronic use in the form of a walker or a wheelchair. And so we'll get to so dissection also allows us to learn a little bit of the history of the person as well. And we'll also get to see examples of surgeries. We'll get to see examples of pathologies depending on how the person passed away. Lots of stories to tell on that one. I won't get too graphic on those. One example that's an interesting one too, that it's not something that I prompt the class for, but something that sort of happens organically, which is always a little bit of amazing. Well, a couple of them. One is like the pituitary. Inevitably we'll kind of we'll find a pituitary, take a look at it in situ, we'll dissect the pituitary out. And without any prompting, almost every class ends up discovering that when they hold that pituitary, it's this little precious little thing that feels way heavier than it actually is, that the experience of trying to move away from the donor while holding the pituitary, it feels like the pituitary gets heavier. And as you get closer, it feels like it gets lighter. And there's something about that little organ that feels almost like it wants to stay in contact with its original structure and not be moved too far away from it. And likewise, in almost every class I've taught, inevitably the participants end up having the discussion about, what is death? Because an awful lot of them will continue to have the sensation of that they can still sort of feel a personality in an organ, or that they can sort of tune into something that is something other than just the physical structure of the organ itself as they kind of work with it. And so the class offers those types of experiences as well. I remember when my daughter was a toddler, she was really young, that she found a stick that was on the ground, and it had a leaf on it. It was still a green leaf, and she pulled the leaf off. And I remember her trying to put the leaf back onto the stick, and it couldn't. And I remember her getting a little frustrated that she could not put the leaf back on the stick. And there was something in that moment, I remember thinking, oh, she's experiencing, the kind of like a toddler version of existential awareness, that it's possible to deconstruct things. It's not really possible to put them back together. That's only something that the magic of the human body can do, and creation and everything else. And so I see that same, that's a toddler story, but we see the same thing in every class, that there is something completely irreversible about the process of human dissection. To take a donor that looks a lot like us, just cold and not moving, and then over the course of several days to have that donor essentially be fully deconstructed, with the awareness once again that they'll never be back in the way they were before we started the process. And so there's something about that process that I think really highlights the fragility of what it means to be human, but also the incredible strength as we work through some of these dissections that are incredibly difficult to do as well. And then as far as just maintaining the respect for the donor, we make sure to begin and end each day with a closing circle and offering words of appreciation to the donors for the gift that they've given us. And then we begin each day with an opportunity for sharing experiences. And inevitably, the participants have really deep existential experiences to just sort of talk about. And so that's where we finally come to the sacred as we come a little bit towards the end of this presentation here. That the reason why I would like to encourage manual therapists to take a dissection course is, at the end of the day, yes, anatomical specificity and precision is important, but I don't think that's the real purpose of why we do it. That the purpose of human dissection is seeing the humanity in our clients and ourselves, and that feeling spontaneously emerges in the work that we do with clients. And also as therapists working within the healing relationship between us and our clients, and that shared humanity that we have, that process, if we're open to it, it facilitates empathy and connection and attunement and understanding and all the features that are necessary for good therapy with a person.